Hello, everyone. I'm Ed Fuller, the editor of the Trackside Photographer, and welcome to another episode of Talking Pictures. Today, we're going to be talking pictures with Charlie Hunter. Charlie, welcome.
Hi, Ed. It's a joy to be here. How are you
Well,
today?
I'm doing fine, and I'm glad to have you here. Um, I wanted to mention that you have a video channel and a series of videos called Reasonably Fine Art Talks, which were sort of the inspiration for what I'm doing here. And I'll put a link to that in the description down below. And I suggest that anyone who's interested take a look at them. There's some very interesting things in there.
That'd be wonderful. And yeah, we've got a chat with Scott Lothus.
Yeah,
There's all kinds of relevant stuff for rail fans with an aesthetic bent.
sure there is. Absolutely. Um, don't want to label you as a railroad artist, but railroad subjects play a significant portion in your work. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and how your interest in railroads came about.
Sure. Well, I figure I like to say that all right-thinking 2-year-olds love trains. They love trains and they love dinosaurs. And I think it's for the same reason, which is both are really big and really kind of scary, but they're probably not going to kill you because dinosaurs are safely in the past. And so you can learn all about the Allosaurus, but it's not going to come and eat you. And trains, you can get up close to them, but they're pretty much guaranteed to stay on the tracks. Um, and so, just like all right-thinking 2-year-olds, I loved trains. I just never stopped loving trains. And as I developed my passion for art, as a little kid, I drew trains, I drew cars, I drew gas stations. I still paint all those things. Um, and as I became more sophisticated in my artistic sensibility, you know, I just use the props of the visual aspects that railroad architecture allows as kind of the way into explorations of form and light and dark and edges and dynamics and composition.
Hmm. I want to quote you on something that you said to Eric Rhodes several years ago in an interview. Eric is the publisher of Plein Air magazine. And during the course of that interview, you said, I happen to be just as moved by Walker Evans' photographs or Dorothea Lange's photographs as I am by Edward Hopper or name an artist of your choice. For me, early 20th century American photography is very much part of how I see the world. It strikes me that painters are often sort of dismissive of photography as an art form. So this statement intrigues me, and I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit, and also do you feel like that the visual language of photography has had an impact on the work that you do?
Absolutely. Well, I think it's crazy if people are dismissive of virtually any other art form.
Mhm.
My beloved sixth grade art teacher, apparently in sixth grade, they were talking about art, and she said, "It's just art. You don't have to like it." And I can't stand listening to hip hop. I mean, it's not designed for me. It's designed for people who are 18 now. And the music I listened to when I was 18 drove my parents crazy. I love American street photography of the 60s and 70s, Gary Winogrand, all that stuff. But I also grew up with Let Us Now Praise Famous Men and looking at the WPA photographs. And geez, it absolutely to me has just as much a beautifully composed photograph is just as difficult to achieve as a painting, and it has just as much capacity to move. You look at a bunch of today's contemporary rail photographers. I mean, not only are they incorporating the lessons of Phil Hastings and Walker Lamb and stuff. Lamb, what's his first name?
Parker, J. Parker Lamb.
not only are they doing that, but you look at Cade Smith or is it Eric Williams? There are a bunch of people who are doing unbelievably beautiful stuff. Joel Jensen. I mean, there's a long, long list. I think it's crazy to dismiss an entire aspect of art just because it doesn't happen to be one's own. I love, since I've started painting monochromatically, I love being able to kind of grab a couple of the tropes of photography and use it in my art, because that sets up a lovely dissonance with the viewer of, is it a painting or is it a photograph?
Right.
You know?
Right. Interesting. It's interesting that you mentioned Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, because when I was in high school, that's the book that got me interested in photography. I went through those beautiful Walker Evans photographs, and I said, this is what I would like to do. I never quite made it through James Agee's prose, but but the book was one of my favorites just for those photographs that were in it.
I had the exact same experience with Agee's prose, so
yeah,
I'm with you on that one.
All right, you want to talk about some pictures?
Absolutely, that's what I live for, to blather about art.
All right, Bellows Falls Depot. This is your hometown, and I think if someone were familiar with your work but had never seen this particular painting, they would immediately say, "Ah, that's a Charlie Hunter."
Yeah, I probably. It's got trains and it's drippy and it's monochromatic. So
right.
When I paint from life, I tend to paint monochromatically, just because there's so much going on. When you're painting, you've got, well, photographers, of course, would understand this about how transient light is. And when you're painting, basically, you've got a 2 or 3 hour window, unless it's an overcast day. But even then, the very subtle shadows shift. But I love painting monochromatically from life, because without having to worry about chroma, I can instead think about value, edge, composition, and how do I tell the story as simply as possible. And the Bellows Falls train station is about 500 yards from my studio. So it's a place several times a year will go down to and just do a quick painting. I love the 3-target USS Signal. That's protecting the old Boston and Maine Conn River line, which is the one going right past us on the left there, and the old Rutland Railroad, which is the one going across. So it protects the diamond. It's where the Bellows Falls ball signal used to be. And then the Bellows Falls train station is just a wonderfully idiosyncratic small town depot. And I figure if haystacks were good enough for Monet, the Bellows Falls train station is good enough for me.
Milford Freight House. This is a little more colorful than the last one that we looked at. Tell us a little bit. I take it this was from a photograph.
Yeah, this is a studio piece, as opposed to the previous one was like a 12 by 16 or 12 by 18 plein air piece. This is a 16 by 32 piece that I did in the studio. I grew up till age 11 in Milford, New Hampshire. And I used to walk home from Garden Street School, which is right over to the left of that, of the viewscape there. I used to walk home along the branch line, the Hillsborough branch of the Boston and Maine. So I'd get out of school, walk down here to basically the Milford Freight House, and then walk down those railroad tracks for about 1.25 miles. And the Milford Freight House is just a wonderful structure. It was a run-through freight house. So there were tracks through that great big door that's got the wood covering it. And it still stands today. So I was back in Milford about 10 years ago and just did a snapshot, and then did drawings from the snapshot, and then did the painting from the drawing. So it's predominantly monochromatic, but it does have color notes in it.
Yeah, it's a lovely painting. I like what's going on in the sky. I'm not quite sure how to read that, but
well, nothing good. You can tell nothing good's going on in that sky. It's there's a technique that I use over on the left where I hit the surface of the painting with a dry paper towel, like waving a little flag of surrender, be like that. And that's what breaks up the tone in the sky over there on the left. And that is one of the tropes from photography that I like. If you look at old glass plate photos, they get scratched and so it has, this is playing with that interplay between painting and photography, and between realism and kind of the memory of a place. I'm not a literal painter. There's a bunch in this that is accurate. There's a bunch in this that is not accurate. But what I'm trying to evoke is a feeling as opposed to a literal rendering of a subject.
Right. Yeah. The subject here is in such an evocative setting, I think.
Yeah, it's just some paint that I smeared over there dark and over there light. That's all it is.
Right. Right. I wanted to talk about this one in particular because this is based on a photograph by Cade Smith, who is actually a trackside photographer contributor. And so to tell us a little bit about this photograph, I mean, this painting and how it came to be.
Well, I think I learned of Cade through trackside photographer. I've never met him, but we have a wonderful online correspondence. Whenever I need signals for a painting, if I need a nice vertical, I just dial up Cade and say, got any single target USS signals from the side? And he'll send over what he's got, and I really appreciate that. I think he's a magnificent photographer. And this painting was done for the American Masters show in New York at the Salmagundi. And Cade's photograph to me was so evocative of kind of the simple grandeur of these remaining signals. I mean, they're so noble. And if you're not a rail fan, you wouldn't know that the backstory of how they're still in service after a century, with Amtrak trains going through at 79 miles an hour, and that they're imperiled and blah, 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 blah. But you don't have to know that to kind of get the sense of how striking they are in this resolutely horizontal landscape, to have these extremely vertical subject matter that just slices into it. And I also, on this, I completely copied Cade's design on this. Very often I will work from photographs, and but I'm not taking the composition from those photographs. This one was very much, this is a painting interpretation of a photograph by Cade.
I like the way you've simplified it, though, in the sense that you're working with the foreground. You got the tracks going across there, and there's really no middle ground, and the rest of it is sky with these two wonderful signals sticking up in it and the light catching them. I just think that's very effective.
Yeah, there really is no middle ground on that. I guess some of those ties in between the two signals, that's pretty much it. But yeah, it's you're either right here or you're way back there.
Right. This one has a special place in my heart because I happen to own this painting, and I just got it from Charlie last week, and I have it hung in a prominent place in my home, and it's beautiful. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. And the cats thank you too, because they're still able to eat the good food because of nice people like you. Right. This piece was in a recent show that I did at the Brattleboro Museum, which itself is an old train station in Brattleboro, Vermont. It's a wonderful non-collection museum. So what they do for all their shows is they have curators, some staff curation and some guest curation. This was curated by Eric Aho, whose father was a Boston and Maine railroader, and he was a trainman and probably worked the Hillsborough branch a couple of times. And this signal, which we called the Wigwag when I was a kid, guarded a crossing at a place called Jones Crossing between Milford and Wilton, New Hampshire. And it was a wonderful signal when you're a little kid, but you assume they're everywhere. I had no idea that this was a very, very rare piece of railroad apparatus. So when a train would approach, the series of red lights up the big dark metal top of the structure would start flashing back and forth. And where it says, look, listen, would let go a mechanical pendulum that would ring and the bell would ring. It was wonderful. And the branch line train would kind of trundle past and you'd usually get a wave from the engineer and the brakeman and the caboose. But this signal stayed in place until the mid 1990s, and it did get preserved. It is at the Boston and Maine Historical Society, I believe. It's disassembled, but it's still extant. Then the thing I liked on the composition of this one is the jangliness of all these kind of vertical lines or horizontal lines of the railroad tracks and the road and the utility lines and everything all kind of coming together. And then the signal standing. And I played with a little bit of color in this. I went black for the structure behind the red lights. And then I did put in red where the bulbs are, but I didn't, it's not an action photo. There's no train coming. So the bulbs are not illuminated. They're just very subtly red.
Yeah, I didn't even notice the red in the photograph. When I got the painting, I saw the red and I was sort of surprised by that. Yeah. But you had mentioned earlier about memory, the role memory plays in your work. And that's one of the things that I really love about this piece is it seems to speak to me from a memory somewhere. And I don't know where that memory comes from. I've obviously never been in this location, but the memory is very much alive there. And particularly when you see the painting itself and see how, see your hand having worked the surface of that, it really adds a dimension to it.
Yeah, that's one thing I love about painting is the battle that goes on when you are painting. And I'm not trying to make a perfect surface. I like the viewer to have seen the evidence of that fight. Mm-hmm. And if you look at like the border between the snow and the road, you can see where I've painted white paint over the road. And I'm fine with that. I'm not, as I say, I'm not a literal painter. There are very painterly aspects to the work that I do. I'm very glad that this feels somewhat dreamlike to you or memory-like to you. Yeah. Because even if, my old mentor, Richard Schmidt, used to say, the great thing about art is that it lets you see what the world feels like to someone else. Mm-hmm. And so maybe it's not a memory of yours, but it's a memory of mine. And if that can be conveyed, seeing one another's, what's important to each other is a way forward during these really polarized times.
Yes, absolutely. And I think you're right. I think that's what comes through in the painting, and more so in the painting than in the photograph that we're looking at on screen.
Good.
Here's another work that I think you said before that this was taken from the window of a train. The photograph that this is based on was taken from the window of a train. Is that correct? Or
that is correct. It was on the Texas Eagle a couple of years ago, going down to Austin. The scene that I snapped, the windows were pretty dirty. We had the family bedroom, which is great because it's got windows on both sides of the car, of course, on the Superliner in the lower level. And it was also really gloomy weather, so it was perfect for taking moody, gloomy photographs. And there was no train on that far track. You know, and this is, maybe it's a far track, maybe it's not. But if we go with the idea that it's a far track, that blue streak that I put on it is suggestive of, say, a container train going through, a single level container train. You know, but I am painting this to leave it open for others to interpret as they see it. It's very much a non-didactic painting.
Yeah, there's a lot going on there visually. It seems more colorful than a lot of your other work, but when you really look at it, the color palette is still very limited.
Yeah, I'm an earth tones guy.
Yeah.
As I say, what I love is, how can you tell a story in using the simplest language possible? I'm not saying that's the best way to tell a story. I'm just saying that that is a challenge that I find really interesting. When I was in college, I took a great creative writing workshop from a fellow named Gordon Lish, who was the fiction editor of Esquire magazine. And he was one of the most influential short fiction editors of the second half of the 20th century. He's also a really weird man, but that's neither here nor there. But Lish really taught us to pay attention to every single word that was in your writing. I was not a good fiction writer, but I have taken that lesson and I try to apply that in my painting.
It's a lovely work. How big is this?
Oh, it's like, I think it's 4 feet across. So it's a little less than 2 feet. So maybe 18 by 48, I forget,
Okay.
20 by 48.
Yeah, this is another one that I would love to see in the original form. I think it'd be great. I noticed on your Facebook page that you just completed a very large painting.
Yeah, I'm real happy with that one. I'm real happy with that one.
Yeah, it looks neat. It's like 48 by 72 or something like that.
Yeah. It's 6 feet high. It's based on an old, do you know the Behringer? You must know the Behringer collection on Flickr. And my favorite, they're all these albums of that I guess John W. Behringer III took off of the rear platform of countless trains. And there's one album where they don't know, where it's just unknown locations. And there's this jiggly one of going through what do we call those?
Truss
bridges?
Yeah, truss bridge.
Yeah, a through truss, right?
Through truss,
going through a through truss, and that's what I based that photograph, that painting on, that I just completed. Very happy with that one. It hits exactly the balance of painterly and photographic that I'm hoping for.
Winslow at La Posada this is a painting that you did on the on-train air trip that you and a group of painters took out west a couple of years ago.
Yeah, the best laid plans of mice and men off Gang No a Guy, as Burns, I think, said. The pandemic came along and kind of scotched those plans. The idea was presented to me by a painter friend named Larry Moore, who said, is there a train that you could take where you paint for a day and then ride it to the next stop and then paint for a day and so on? And that was just at the time that idiot Richard Anderson was proposing substituting a bus between Garden City, Kansas and Albuquerque and severing the Southwest Chief, which is one of my favorite trains. And so I said, yeah, I know a really good route where we could do that. And so we went overnight, five painter friends. We went overnight from Chicago to La Junta, and most of them, I don't think any of them had ever done overnight in a sleeping car before. So we went overnight to La Junta, Colorado, painted for a day in La Junta, went down the line to Trinidad, the next stop, painted for a day in Trinidad, then up Raton Pass, painted for a day in Raton, then to Las Vegas, New Mexico, then to Lamy, did a show at my gallery in Santa Fe, and then the plein air convention was out in San Francisco that year. So we got back on the Southwest Chief, went to La Posada, stayed for a couple of days, and anyone who's a rail fan who has not yet been to La Posada, drop everything you're doing and make your plans and go there. Where this painting was painted from is kind of the rail fan viewing area, right by the tracks, nonstop coming and going of freight trains, beautifully manicured grounds, and a very affordable hotel. So this is another plein air piece, just monochrome, working just monochrome, and it's really paying attention to the edges. That's edges and values, edges and values.
For someone in our audience who may not be familiar with the term plein air, tell us what you mean by that.
Plein air means painting outside. It's the American insecurity with just taking something artistic and being plain spoken about it. Instead, we gussy up the idea of painting outside by calling it plein air, en plein air. So it's just painting from life.
I wanted to comment on your use of these strong verticals, and particularly the poles. You know, a lot of photographers have trouble with poles and they want to get rid of them, but you use them very effectively here. And I've heard you say that part of the role that they play in your paintings is to sort of connect the sky and the ground.
Right, they stitch the earth and the sky together. To me, one of the profound subject matters, kind of the meta subject matters of a lot of representational art or photography, is what my shorthand is: things of God, things of man, i.e. the natural world versus the man-made world. And utility poles certainly connect the two realms of God, the earth and sky, with a resolutely man-made stitch line. And I mean, here you've got the earth, you've got the sky, you've got the man-made horizontals going crazy there from the left over to the right, and then you've got the man-made verticals. And the idea of incorporating utility poles, I like the idea of artistic or aesthetic jujitsu. What is something that seems like a liability, and how do you turn that into an asset? And to me, utility poles are the ultimate example, or an ultimate example of that.
This photograph, I'm sorry, this painting, I can't get my head out of the world of photography here. This painting reminds me, though.
This work, you could say this work, this work.
This work, there you go, this work. That would apply to both, wouldn't it? This work reminds me of Edward Hopper. The stillness, the sort of sense of expectancy or waiting. And it's not real typical of your work. I think you'd said before that this was a fairly early on for you.
Well, it was far enough along that I was pretty good at rendering what I wanted to render. Mm-hmm. So it was done about 2000. And what happened for me was I was painting a lot in the late 80s, early 90s. And then the way I was making a living at that time was as a music manager. And a couple of our clients started doing very, very well. And I really didn't have time to paint anymore. Or I was doing these large pastel pencils. And in the early 2000s, when I quit the music business, not out of any intelligence, I just was sick of it. I went back to doing images the way I had been doing them, which was to take a photograph, graph it out, and then, graph out the large on the pastel paper, and then basically copy the photograph. So very, very accurately. This was a commission where a woman for her husband's birthday wanted an image of a memory that was really important to him, which was him as a child being taken by his father down to Bellows Falls and getting the budliner from Bellows Falls to Boston. And so I researched, outfits, what people would have been wearing at the time, what bud cars went from Bellows Falls to Boston at that time. I put in the Rutland Railroad Bridge behind the RDC, and then to the left is the Bellows Falls Ball Signal. I got the people out there on the right track. Everything is pretty much correct, though I later found out that I think at the time that this would have been, there was a sheet metal snowplow kind of attached to the RDC that ran up to Bellows Falls. So the very front of the budliner is a little bit wrong. But this is how I used to paint, and I think it does have a. I like this piece, but it's quite literal. It's as close to rivet counting art as I get.
Mm-hmm. I think that one thing that comes across to me very strongly is the figures in this, and the sense of intimacy between the father and the son there, which is not Hopper-esque at all, because people who in Hopper's paintings never seem to be occupying the same space, or sometimes not even the same planet. So I think you've captured something very, very warm and evocative there.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. No, yeah, Hopper, the people, every single couple in a Hopper painting needs counseling.
Jersey Central. Tell us about this one, Charlie, please.
This is another commission, also from this is maybe a couple of years after that previous RDC painting. This was a feller who had grown up along the Jersey Central tracks. He loved that particular bridge. He gave me source photos to work from, and we were talking about how the Northeastern railroads just kind of pitched into complete ruin in from the 50s to the 70s. So the kind of aesthetic that I was going for here was that beat up boxcar look. We included the Jersey Central logo. We just talked about things that he liked. So we incorporated the Jersey Central logo, but I wanted to have kind of the rust of what nature does to what man creates as kind of a secondary theme to what is a pretty literal painting.
And our last painting for today is called After Lamb, and we'd mentioned J. Parker Lamb's photography before, and this is, I take it, based on a photograph by Lamb.
Absolutely. I try to be, at least, they say that a good thief tips his hat, and this is basically Lamb's composition. I simplified it greatly, because one of the things that I am fascinated by is how much you can leave out and still have something read almost photographically. Really, this is just the edges, the left-hand edges of the locomotive and of the freight cars on the right, with the telephone lines, the telephone poles behind the crossbars behind. That's really the only area of detail. Everything else is just a suggestion. Now, this is an encaustic, so it's an oil painting with a hot wax. It's beeswax and damar that is liquefied by heat, poured over the oil painting. Then it hardens, it cools, and then I buffed in additional glazes of oil paint on top of the wax. And I did more of that hitting with the paper towel to evoke the idea of an old glass plate photograph. I did this one a few years ago, and I think in probably about 2016, and I'm still pretty happy with it. I like this one a lot.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's basically just light and dark shapes with enough detail to get our wonderful brains to see a picture.
Yep. And again, that's back to the idea of how can you tell the story the simplest way possible. And I am amazed at how our brains, if you render one little bit of the painting plane with care, you can then get away with an amazing amount of murkiness.
Yeah. Yeah, and you see paintings and they have figures in them, and you take a look at them real close, and they're basically just a brush stroke, and there's not much to them, but yet they read as figures. We say, oh, there's people walking down the street.
Yeah, well, I took during pandemic time, I tried to take advantage of the fact that we were essentially housebound, and I took an online painting workshop from a watercolor friend of mine, Andy Evenson, because I wanted to learn how watercolor worked. And I learned that John Singer Sargent's quote, which is that painting in watercolor is like trying to paint in the middle of an emergency. It's absolutely accurate. But one of Andy's great lessons was, in a group of figures, you need to render one or two of the figures, and then the rest can just be the vaguest brushstrokes. And you're going to read it as, oh, right, there's a whole group of people. It's amazing. It's amazing what our brains do.
Yeah, yeah. When you say watercolor feels like an emergency, is that because it just dries so fast, and once it's dried, as opposed to oil, you can't really do a whole lot more work with it?
Pretty much. With watercolor, you've got to keep a bead of wet paint moving across your surface. That's how you get those beautiful kind of blended effects. And if you wait too long, it dries, and then it's putting the toothpaste back in the tube. So, yeah.
Well, Charlie, this has been wonderful, and I thank you so much for joining us today and discussing your work. And again, I thank you so much for the painting that I have. I've really enjoyed it since I've had it, and I just want to say that I appreciate your work, and I appreciate your taking the time to be here with us today. Charlie, it's been great. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been great fun.